whenever I first became a Christian, I attended a church that the worship service was very, very different than the way that we do it here at Networks Church. And we would sing, we would sing about 4 songs. They were out of a hymn book at different spots in the worship service. Someone would read some scripture. The preacher would get up and preach for 25, 30 minutes, something like that. And then it would be over and we'd go to Dairy Queen. And that was kind of the way it was. And so, and as you would look over the congregation, I mean, it was you could hear a pin drop in the place. I mean, it was just quiet and no hands raised, no dancing, nothing like that. And then as I got a little bit older, I started going to a church that was completely the opposite of that, and it was a little bit different. We didn't use hymn books, and the songs were on an overhead projector, and people would raise up their hands during the worship time, and they would sing out loud, and it was a little bit loud. It was a little bit boisterous, and I remember at the time kind of really getting into that. I was kind of like, hey, this is kind of fun, because I was used to kind of just sitting there. And then when I got to the place where I thought, I can kind of move around a little bit, I was kind of excited about that. And then Karen and I, after that, we were on staff at a church that the demographic of the church was about 25% African American and probably about 10 to 15% Hispanic. And our worship leader was African American. And let me tell you something, you can move in that church. And I mean you could get down. And it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that. And it would not be uncommon to be standing there and look over and just see something, just do a little bit of that over there, and I'd be kind of like, okay, yeah, and then you just kind of go back to your thing. And some days there would be stuff that was a little bit what we would probably consider a little bit bizarre. I mean, it was very, very uninhibited. Okay, so here's the deal right here. How do you put all that together? Here's the thing, is I've kind of grown in my understanding a little bit, is at every one of those junctures, I can remember the Spirit of God being so strong and touching me and changing me. And I felt like I could be totally uninhibited in any one of those settings. And I remember whenever I hear some of those hymns on the radio, maybe it'll come on, or I'll hear kind of a remake of a hymn that I remember singing whenever I was a kid, man, it brings tears to my eyes. Because I can remember what God did, and man, I will worship the Lord, and I feel so, oh God, you mean that. And then I can think of some of the times in some of those worship services where you kind of dance around a little bit, and man, that was fun. I really enjoyed that a lot. And so I think the thing that every church has got to do is you just kind of got to decide where you're going to be at. And somewhere, Networks Church, is we just kind of decided we'd be somewhere right there in the middle of it. And I really don't think there's anything wrong with any one of those styles. I don't think there's anything biblically inappropriate with any of that. But one of the things I do think is this right here, is that there was a time in the Bible, David, we all know King David, where he stripped down to his underwear and danced before the Lord because he was so excited about the Ark of the Covenant coming back in. And he danced right there before God and before everybody else, and he was totally uninhibited. And I will say this, if you come to church next Sunday and strip down to your underwear and dance around, you are out of order. I don't want you to do that. Why? Because that would not be edifying. It may edify you immensely, and you may love it, but I promise you the person sitting next to you is not going to love it. It's going to be really, really bizarre. So here's what you need to do, okay? Is when you're worshiping God, and when you're here in this congregation, well, let me say this first. Whenever you're in your prayer room, your quiet time, do whatever you want to do. Okay? And sometimes if you were to be a fly on the wall of my quiet time, you would look at me and you would laugh your head silly, because sometimes I do some really strange things. But whenever we come here together, this is a good way to think of it, is when you come here, I want you to think, I am coming here with an attitude of praise and thanksgiving. And what I like to do is I close my eyes and I just go before the Lord and I just think, me and Him right here. And if there is any question in your mind, if you think, man, I don't know what I should be doing or what I shouldn't be doing, then think of it this way, is we want to bring attention to Him and not to ourselves. If you feel like you want to do something, you may be okay and right in that, but if it's going to bring more attention to yourself than it is to God, then you should refrain from doing that. Okay? So that's kind of my answer on that. I think that some of you are here, and I think some of you need to be, you need to kind of get out a little bit. I mean, you need to loosen up, and that's okay. You can do that. One of the things that's really interesting is we've had people that have come here, and they will say things like, "Man, I wish I could do more." And then we've had people that have come here and they said, "Oh my gosh, you guys are, oh my goodness, I've never been in anything like this before." It is just the epitome of freedom for them. And why is that? Because there's a broad spectrum, and we have, this is a cool thing, we have appealed to a broad spectrum. We have people that come to this church that maybe they have a Catholic background, or maybe they have more of a Methodist or Baptist background. We have people that come that maybe have a little bit more of a Pentecostal flair to it. And here's the deal, is all that stuff is great, but here's what we're doing. The number one thing is we are trying to lift up God and glorify Him. Okay? And then there's a little third part. Can worship be a spectator activity? No. I do not think it can be. And here's a scripture right here, Romans 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So no, I don't think that worship is a spectator sport. I think it is you and Him and active. But keep in mind, is you cannot always tell by outward appearance what is active. Okay? So you might think, well, active means you're dancing. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that. Someone could be standing there in a church doing nothing, not even moving their mouth, and they can be so deep in worship. Okay, so you cannot always judge by outward appearances. You can't do it. Remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they outwardly looked like they were in a lot of activity, but they were not. They were dead men's bones on the inside. Okay? So don't judge it by the outward. Okay? So that's question number one. Now let's go on to question number two. This was a really popular question. More than one person asked this one, and I'm sure we've all thought this. Do pets, animals, go straight to heaven? They didn't sin against God. And I was actually going to give a really quick answer to this, but then I got to thinking, man, I don't know if I've really studied about this a lot. So I started going to the Bible to figure this one out. And here's what I found. In Genesis, it talks about men and animals both being formed from the same ground, where you could say, well, the bodies are kind of similar in a way, but then there's no mention of eternity. There's no mention of heaven with that. Also in Genesis, we have the story of Noah, where God saved both animals and people on the ark, and He seemed to make this covenant that seemed to kind of go for both of them. But that covenant was that He would never destroy the earth again with water. It had nothing to do with eternity, so we don't really know from that. And then the fourth commandment, which is to keep the Sabbath day and keep it holy, we see that applied to not only people, but it applied to animals. Your animals were not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day, and I thought that was kind of interesting. But there again, there's no mention if they're going to be in heaven or not. And then in Isaiah, there's a passage that talks about this is kind of a prophecy, at some future time that we don't know about. It talks about Christ as the rod from the stem of Jesse that will bring peace in such a way that animals and people will live in harmony together. But you can't say from that necessarily that that's talking about heaven or eternity as well. Now,